Hello and welcome to your weekly look at events inside Syria. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, the Syrian conflict appears to show no sign of ending anytime soon. A second round of peace talks ended in Geneva last week without making any real progress. Syrian negotiators were insistent on the need to fight what they called terrorists. The opposition, on the other hand, well, their delegation continued to stress the need for a transitional administration to run the country until elections can be held. Now, UN envoy Lakhdar Brahimi said it was difficult to find any common ground between the two sides. Meanwhile, fighting inside the country goes on. Syrian activists say hundreds of people have died in airstrikes on rebel-held areas over the last few days. The fighting has forced even more civilians to cross Syria's borders in search of safety. Well, part of the political and military stalemate stems from the fact that both sides in the Syrian conflict have powerful backers. Bashar al-Assad still appears to enjoy the unwavering support of Russia, Iran and the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah. The US, a few European countries and some Gulf states have backed the rebel cause. But the presence of an increasing number of foreign fighters in Syria, some claiming allegiance to al-Qaeda, is greatly complicating the situation. Their presence has deterred the US, for example, from agreeing to supply heavy weapons to the rebels for fear that they could end up in the so-called wrong hands. Well, to discuss some of these issues further, let me introduce our guest now. Joining us from Jeddah is Saudi political commentator Hussein Shobukshi. Richard Murphy, a former US ambassador to Syria and Saudi Arabia, joins us from the US state of Colorado. And in London, James Denslow, a Middle East analyst at the Foreign Policy Centre. Good to have you with us. If I could start with Mr. Shobukshi. The Syria Peace Conference, I guess you could say no surprise, ended without any great breakthrough. Do you think it's prompting a rethink of Syria policy amongst some of the Gulf backers of the Syrian opposition?
Well, it's very obvious that there is a party, specifically the Russians and the Chinese, who are taking an aggressive stand in protecting the regime in Syria and not allowing it to compromise. The key word here is compromise. They're not giving in at all to the demands of the rebels and the popular uprising in Syria that has been going on for over 3 years now. It is clear that the Russians are going to only have it their way, and only their way is to maintain the status quo as it is and give al-Assad's regime an ability to stay in power and let the dialogues take their toll while the killings continue.
So how are people in the, or policymakers in the Gulf capitals responding to this situation, do you think, now?
I think they're responding also to the demand by their citizens. There's a great sympathy to the Syrian cause now in every Gulf state, and I think almost in every country in the Arab world. They will increase the donations on the humanitarian aid, but I think also the support for the rebels is going to see a dynamic new upswing. The circus that took place in Geneva is obviously prolonging the crises and the misery of the Syrians, and it's only, as the French say, it's pour la forme. It's just simply a showcase, nothing more.
All right, let's go over to Ambassador Murphy. You know, it's been reported there was a recent meeting in Washington involving the intelligence chiefs of the United States as well as intelligence chiefs from the Middle East region, coordinating the idea of new sophisticated weapons dispatches, so-called man-pads. Is the Obama administration changing its thinking now to how it approaches Syria?
First, I think that the American side is trying to improve the coordination between itself, the Europeans that have been supporting the Turks, supporting the rebel side, and friends and allies in the Arab world. Now, does this mean that a decision has been taken to supply the type of equipment such as man-pads, which President Obama has been very reluctant to supply in the past because he's been concerned about them getting in, as you said, to the wrong hands? I don't know whether that decision has been taken, but we're moving in that direction in trying to get a clearer picture on the ground in Syria with the cooperation of the intelligence services, Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, Jordan, to understand and coordinate getting those weapons to the right hands.
All right, interesting point, Mr. Denslow. Could we say that although the Syria peace conference didn't achieve anything during the talks, it's building momentum for a new kind of synergy between the backers of the opposition now?
I think it's a really interesting point. I think that while there was a predictable failure to Geneva II, partly because the expectations and understandings from both sides as to what the conference represented were so vast, there is perhaps unpredictable consequences as to what happens next. And I think the word you used about rethink is particularly important here. The Syrian opposition, I think, came out quite well from Geneva II. It was fairly unified, it appeared statesmanlike, it appeared pragmatic and sensible, while the regime often appeared very angry in press conferences, quite defensive. It was ambushed by the mother of a killed British doctor that looked very bad. So perhaps now we have this moment where the Syrian opposition, which has been characterised as highly divided, now we can look actually at the supporters of that opposition that have their own divisions and think as to whether they can better unite in terms of their aims, objectives and coordination. And nowhere more so is that true than of the Americans and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, I think, has been extremely unhappy with US policy, and not just towards Syria but towards the rest of the region. I think the decision in November of the Saudis not to accept a seat at the Security Council was an incredible moment. And I think perhaps now, with Obama's visit to Saudi Arabia in March and these meetings in Washington and a change of personnel at the top, we might find ourselves with a new unified proxy opposition support base from Riyadh and from Washington.
And on that point, Mr. Shabokshi, as I'm sure you know, the Arabic-speaking media as well as the English-speaking media lately have been buzzing with reports, and I should say these are media reports, haven't been officially confirmed in Saudi Arabia, but the reports say that the Syria file of Saudi policy has been taken off the Saudi intelligence chief and given to the Minister of Interior, Mohammed bin Nayef. What do we actually know about this, and whether it signifies any real change in how Saudi Arabia is approaching Syria?
Well, the basic answer to this, we don't know much about this, and I think it's merely reporters' speculation. However, we need to highlight something very significant. After the Saudis have announced some very important steps to combat any jihadists fighting abroad or intending to fight abroad or supporting fighters abroad, this is an Ministry of Interior jurisdiction, so it is natural that the Minister of Interior, Mohammed bin Nayef, will be involved in files of such nature, but it remains to be seen if it is officially, completely will be transferred to him as a matter of operations, not just a matter of jurisdiction.
Okay, Ambassador Murphy, if, for example, the Saudi Minister of Interior is now being more involved, shall we say, in the Syria file, one way or another, would that make a big difference to how the US views its policy and whether there are sufficient guarantees as to the the so-called end user of weapons?
I think it definitely can be helpful. There's been a close cooperation between the minister and the American authorities over the last several years, and it's been a good working relationship. So there's I think mutual confidence there. The period of irritation certainly reached its peak last October, November, as Mr. Denslow was saying, and there have been several efforts made from the American side to explain our position, to attempt to bring about a better understanding of what we're aiming at, be it in terms of supplying the rebels, training the rebels, our position on the Bahraini issue, and perhaps for some of the Saudi leadership, our efforts to normalize or build up a different relationship with Iran. And the trip next month by President Obama to Riyadh to meet with His Majesty will be a major effort to continue that process of explaining how we need to work together. Because the split that was talked about in October, that there was going to be a major shift in Saudi policy, meaning away from the United States, that certainly caught President Obama's attention, and the realization that what he has been trying to do is perhaps only empowered the regime in Damascus and the extremists among the rebel groups. And that is not in the interest of getting to a transitional government and getting to a peaceful solution.
All right, well, perhaps a point we should keep in mind here, Mr. Denslow, when we talk about how, you know, if the allies of the Syrian opposition may be mending some fences here, maybe starting to think about more sophisticated weaponry being sent to them. What about the other side? How will the regime react on the ground? Of course, they've been conducting a very fierce barrel bombing campaign for a few months. They're not going to sit idly by, are they, and watching this? What will be their potential response to this?
Well, they've not been sitting idly by. In fact, during the Geneva II process, as it has lasted, we've seen a significant uptick in the use of violence and the use of military attacks and barrel bombs in places like Aleppo, and an actual uptick in the death toll. I think obviously the regime is anxious to take advantage of its momentum, that it seems to be slowly winning ground across the country. I think the focus perhaps is on whether this rapprochement between Riyadh and Washington will result in high-tech weaponry appearing. But I think we have to be careful here, because is this actually about diplomatic fences being mended between these two countries around things such as a unity of vision vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda? Is it about a sense of knowing what you don't want in Syria, i.e. these groups empowered and unleashed, versus what you do in a sense of are you willing to put in the level of military support that could perhaps change the balance on the ground? And I think the guest in Saudi Arabia referenced that point, the idea that the Saudis have now put out this decree about prison sentences of between 3 and 21 years for nationals that go to fight abroad, the fact that there are supposedly 2,500 Saudi foreign fighters in Syria. And I think the difference between Saudi government policy towards Syria and, of course, individuals and groups that were willing to put people across and support groups in a different way. So I think there's actually a huge amount of questions around what would this rapprochement actually mean, and would it actually suddenly result in this kind of long promised but never seen idea of manpads turning up in the hands of Syrian rebels. I think the difference between discussions of arming the rebels now and in previous years is now the rebels, or certain large groups of the Syrian opposition, are against and fighting on the ground against Al-Qaeda linked groups. So we almost have this three-way conflict now. And I think whereas the Americans are very unclear as to their position vis-a-vis the Syrian opposition, they are clear with their position vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda.
And that is an interesting point. Mr. Shabukshi, now, is the timing of the change in the leadership of the Free Syrian Army, the FSA, is that at all linked to some of these factors that we're talking about now, that the Geneva peace talks have broken down and there seems to be some rethink of policy amongst the allies of the Syrian opposition?
Of course, I think there is a great link between these two events. The Syrian Free Army is looking for some more sophisticated management of its tactics, much better experience, much better execution, in preparation, I think, for some serious arming and some serious intelligence to be involved. There is a great sense of frustration and almost despair that the world community has basically let them down, and they will increase the pressure on the regime somehow. There is an interest, as I just told you, from the governments and as well as the populations in the Gulf and the Arab countries to support this. Now, how will this be executed and applied is going to be very challenging and interesting. But I don't think by any stretch of the imagination we are seeing the defeat of the Syrian Free Army on the hands of the regime, which has been reported left, right and center that they've been gaining grounds and almost getting ready to finalize everything. This is far from the truth.
And talking about challenges for the Free Syrian Army, Mr. Denslow, even if the new leader of the FSA, Colonel Abdullah al-Bashir, even if he tightens the command structure of the network of groups that we call the FSA, the most powerful factions on the ground in Syria aren't part of the FSA. They're not even part of the Supreme Military Council. In fact, some of them recently left the Supreme Military Council and joined another rival network called the Islamic Front. That's a bit of a challenge for the effectiveness of the FSA, isn't it?
It is, but in a conflict where proxy powers are supporting different allies, if you will, the idea of a unity externally could, of course, try and mend some of that factionalism on the ground. So instead of different countries supporting different groups, you could have, as we've discussed, this unity of effort, unity of understanding and of priorities that could suddenly bring together in a far more effective and cohesive manner these different groups that have struggled over the last 3 years to cohere both tactically on the ground and in terms of their relations with external powers. So I would say again that the test of this new kind of alliance between opposition backers is in how it then transforms either groups on the ground's loyalties and of course the point about what technology, what military resources and assets they're suddenly given.
All right, Mr. Shabukshi, before the Syrian peace talks even ended, we did have statements from some Gulf countries, like Qatar's foreign minister, speaking about the possibility of UN Security Council intervention. Do you think that's a real possibility, that Gulf states are thinking about taking this issue back to the Security Council?
Obviously, it has not been so because there is not a unified stand within the United Nations Security Council, particularly from Russia. Russia has refused to put any resolution on the table within the Security Council that would, by any stretch of the imagination, reduce the sovereignty of the Assad regime on the ground. And that's practically what would happen in this case.
Well, if I could bring Ambassador Murphy back into the discussion now. When we talk about factions of the Syrian opposition, has the United States resolved its policy entirely as to what factions it's willing to do business with? We know they've resolved the question of what faction they're not willing to do business with, those factions, the few that are linked to Al-Qaeda. But when it comes to who the US can do business with, is that crystallized yet for the US?
I think it's better, it's clearer today than it has been. This is a constant process of consulting, developing a better, richer understanding of the opposition. Our efforts to bring a sense of political unity among opposition elements has been just as complicated as trying to get the rebel elements within Syria, the fighters, together in under a single or at least a better coordinated operation. The Russians have taken the easy course. We're going to deal with the regime. If the regime is changed by the will of the Syrian people, we'll deal with that new regime, which has meant they're just continuing their arms supply in support of the status quo. I think, mention was just made of the United Nations. There's a vote today. I think it's going to finally be held today on a resolution on the humanitarian side, how to move economic, medical assistance, supplies to the civilian population. They have been suffering enormously. It's not getting any better. And if Russia blocks this with a further veto, I think that in itself will stimulate an acceleration in American planning to move on the military side, let's call it, because this cannot continue where indifference, okay, to international practice, that the regime, the sovereign power, can say how its borders will be respected. The fact is that there is a responsibility, an international responsibility, to protect populations under severe oppression. And that has not been applied to the Syrian case yet.
Now, Mr. Densler, that some have read some signals, shall we say, of the possibility of better cooperation amongst Security Council powers when it comes to Syria, at least on the issue of humanitarian aid. Do you see that as a real positive development that could lead to perhaps bigger things on more than simply getting aid into Syria when it comes to the Security Council?
Well, it's hard to tell. I think that there's a high likelihood today that this resolution will pass and we will find ourselves with two UN Security Council resolutions on Syria, one on chemical weapons getting out and one on humanitarian aid getting in. But of course the proof will ultimately be in its implementation, whether the sieges that are currently affecting tens of thousands of Syrians on the ground will be lifted, whether the United Nations and its agencies will be allowed to cross borders where previously it hasn't, whether the 9.3 million Syrians who are dependent on humanitarian aid today receive that. I think the humanitarian aid is, of course, addressing a symptom of a conflict, not the cause. But if you can't agree on that, then I think the systems that are accountable for international norms have a real problem. And I think that having the Russians and the Americans on board, as they have been on Geneva, has a certain process, a certain track. If another veto or another double veto occurs, I think there's every likelihood that people will be looking again to questions of unilateral action or different groups taking action themselves rather than through international fora.
Ambassador Murphy, some say that what happens in the Security Council and the dynamic of what's happening between Russia on the one hand, for example, and some of the other Western powers is linked to other developments, maybe Ukraine. How do you see that dynamic?
I think that the Russian motivation in its support for the Assad regime is very firm on several grounds, that it considers, it's looked at the alternatives perhaps, and it sees no leadership able to put down the extreme Islamists, as they like to call them, the terrorists. No one's better equipped than the regime, and the regime is there. Russia's going to work with it. Now, is this part of a Russian campaign to restore Russian influence in the region? It's a possibility. But I think that the Russians, it didn't have to be in a situation in the Ukraine to change Russian thinking about Syria. Its support has been major, constant, unyielding for the regime. And our efforts to persuade it to think about a transitional government have simply not succeeded. They say we are naive. Those who would argue that a transitional government will be a help, they say that's just a way of helping the terrorists by delaying the end of fighting. So I think that procedure, that way of thinking in Russia, they may be certainly upset today about developments in the Ukraine, but their policy on Syria has been firm and unyielding over the past year.
Mr. Shahbukshi, while we talk about big politics, we should, of course, keep in mind it's the average Syrian who suffers. A lot of people killed, a lot of people displaced, and according to UN reports, you know, both sides have made mistakes, but the majority of the suffering inflicted by the Syrian regime. Now, all throughout this, you could say we've been here before, where regional actors have been keen to supply more weapons, better weapons to the opposition to finish the regime. But the assumption has always been that that hasn't happened, will not happen, unless there is a green light from the US. Do you see that assumption changing going forward?
No, I don't. And I think there has not been a clear signal from the states that it is willing to go all the way to remove al-Assad. It has provided some important lip service, but unfortunately that lip service was very taxing because it basically gave al-Assad the green light to go further. Once the Americans clearly said that he has lost his legitimacy and then he has crossed the red line, nothing really took place to penalize him. He got away with murder. Yes, there was an attempt to take away the weapons from him, but there was no punishment to the criminal. And that is a very dangerous dual message that the Americans are sending. We will take away the weapon, but we will not punish you for the crime. Can you imagine what
my question, Mr. Shahbukshi, do you think Gulf countries will continue to wait for that American green light before they go ahead on their own accord and try and supply better or more sophisticated weapons?
Well, I think they are doing this somehow, but to take it a step further is going to really become costly to these countries, because they will be falling against the Americans themselves in this case. It's a very delicate diplomatic and political price to pay.
All right, let's thank our guests because we are running out of time. Mr. Shahbukshi, Ambassador Murphy and Mr. Denslow, thank you all for joining us on this edition of Inside Syria. That's it for this edition of Inside Syria. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.